Okay, good morning. We are going to do a prophecy update right now. It's a little bit earlier than we usually do. I'm going to talk about the age of insecurity because that's not necessarily what people were talking about, but I do subscribe to foreign affairs. I'm not a globalist. I like to read what they're thinking and talking about. This is put out by the Council on Foreign Relations. And there's a big article in it. Their cover this month is Democracy Dying. They think it is. I saw a panel that they did recently at their office in D.C. or New York, in D.C., and they were talking about it's just terrible that all these people that support nationalism are rising to power. Because why? Because this goes against the global order that they've long wanted to establish. So they're calling it the age of insecurity. Yet everything that they talk about is security, peace and security. And you'll see that that was one of the main themes, I think, that came out this week. We talk each week about the convergence of events, about how things seem to be rocketing to a conclusion. I do think it is near the end. It is the end times. I think it's the return of the Lord. The second coming is getting closer and closer. A lot of things that we will see that will happen during the 70th week are the foundations of that are being laid very clearly right in front of our eyes. A couple things. In June, I think it's 9th and 10th, Saturday and Sunday, Randy Smith and I are going to do a little Bible and prophecy conference here at FBC. We're going to talk about Israel because this is the 70th anniversary of Israel, and we'll be sharing some more things about that in the week at that time. There's some things I wanted to say today, but I'm just not going to have the time because we have some guest speakers. One thing that you might want to check out today it's usually live streamed is the Jerusalem Post conference from New York. Caroline Glick is speaking. Roseanne Barr is speaking. I know it's kind of a juxtaposition there a little bit. She actually, though, Roseanne actually tweeted my prophecy update a couple times and sent me a thing about, hey, John Haller, what do you think about this? So I guess she's watched, unless it's a fake Roseanne Barr, but I mean, who would, it's always, why would you fake being Roseanne Barr, although she's very successful now with the relaunch of her show. So she'll be speaking, Ehud Olmert, Naftali Bennett, and a number of other, Avigdor Lieberman, the defense minister, are all speaking. So that starts about 9 a.m. in New York City and should be live streamed today. So you might want to check that out later after you listen to the prophecy update and the FBC live stream. Where to start? Well, let's start with this. I worked very, very hard to cut down my slides, and I cut down my slides, but I didn't cut down the things that I could talk about. This is an article by Kimberly Strassel in the New York Times the other day. There's a very close parallel between what is going on in Israel and what is going on in the United States. As you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu and even Mrs. Netanyahu have been threatened with indictment for many months now. It's really over a year that they keep saying that the indictments are imminent, that they're coming down closely. And Netanyahu, the claims against him are that he got free cigars and some food and some alcoholic beverages from friends, and they were bribes. And the charges are really, I think, silly and ridiculous. They say they involved several $100,000. Sarah Netanyahu is claimed to have, I think she was ordering takeout for too many people at the Prime Minister's restaurant. And so they've been threatening her and her husband with indictment for months now. Now, there have been reports that they're going to be indicted this week. They're going to be indicted this week. The police have recommended it. The police person in charge, I believe, is not going to be reappointed. He's had a real desire to get Netanyahu for a long period of time. But the same thing is going on here in the United States with regard to the Trump and the Mueller investigation. Now, I'm an attorney. I've been involved in some matters that came about under the FBI in the age of Mueller. I will say that what the FBI has done for some time now, but it was particularly true under Mueller when he was directing it. He became the FBI director either a week before or a week after 9/11. Congressman Louis Gohmert issued about a 48-page report that you can find online and download, detailing the problems that he has with Mueller. He does not think Mueller is a good guy. He doesn't like what he's done. I've seen the way the investigations went, and what they did to Michael Cohen, what they did to Paul Manafort, whether they're guilty or not, they engaged in what I think Joe DeGeneva, a former U.S. attorney from the Southern District of New York, called in terrorem searches. They came in, no-knock searches in the middle of the night, and they took everything. And I've seen this happen with the FBI, with a company that was being considered for fraud. And they come in and they take everything. I mean, they take everything. In the case I was involved in, they took almost 40 million pages of documents and all the computers and everything from the company. The company had to file for bankruptcy. The DOJ came in. Some of the same people involved in the Trump investigation, Russian collusion, whatever they're doing. I don't know what they're still doing, but they took everything, and the company had to file for bankruptcy. And then the DOJ said, "Well, we'll charge the company with a crime, much like they did with Arthur Anderson, unless you agree to waive attorney-client privilege, so we can have access to all of your files and your communications with your attorneys." Well, the company had no choice but to file bankruptcy. They had no choice but to waive the attorney-client privilege. It's the same thing that's being done with regard to Manafort and Cohen. They've come in and they've taken everything. Cohen had a relationship with a very large law firm, one of the largest law firms in the world. They executed the search. That afternoon, he was terminated by the law firm. Their relationship was terminated. And this is what they do because they're trying to flip him. They're trying to get him to say something, and I must tell you, I don't think the FBI, at least some of these people, care whether they're getting the truth or not. What they want to get is what? A win, a victory. They want to get a prosecution. They want to take down the big fish. And so they go after the littler people in an effort to do this. I believe it's an abusive process. We've seen a lot of abusive process in the United States. Daniel Horowitz is an attorney, and he has an article over at Conservative Review. And just let me briefly do this. It was written last Monday. It details, the title of the article is 7 Crazy Court Rulings in Just 1 Week. And then I heard him interviewed a couple of days later on Frank Gaffney's Secure Freedom Radio, and he said, if I had waited a day, I could have done 12 crazy court rulings this week. Listen to what some of these court rulings just in the recent past have been. Now, listen, this does have a Bible prophecy aspect to it, whether you believe it or not. Jesus said, warn his disciples that you will be brought, what? Before magistrates, judges, kings. I think he did that in order. And so the thing that I personally fear the most is a rogue prosecutor, because they can absolutely destroy your life. Jesus warned us that there was a time coming, and it was true with regard to the apostles and the disciples, and I think it will be true with us in the end times, that we will be brought before judges, because we've totally lost the plot of what our constitutional structure is in this country. And the judges are making rulings. Listen, these are just some of the rulings. I'll just read a few paragraphs. 10 years are not enough for due process for a criminal alien convicted twice of burglary. In the highest profile case last week, Sessions versus DeMaia, Neil Gorsuch, who was appointed by Trump, joined the 4 liberal justices in the Ninth Circuit in striking down an entire statute dealing with deportation of criminal aliens. It was the first such action of the court and upended a century of precedent stating that due process does not apply against deportation. The decision will have far-ranging consequences, including opening the door for criminal aliens already deported to relitigate their claims. The statute said that if someone was convicted of a serious crime, they could be deported. For 100 years, people have understood what a serious crime is, but now these people on the Supreme Court are making political decisions. And they've decided that felony convictions, well, the statute is vague, so we're going to strike down the entire statute. Now listen, what Congress should have done is they should have got together the next day and clarified it, but we have a Congress that can't seem, I don't know, do these guys need people to lead them to the bathroom? Because I don't think they can do anything at this point. Here's another one. Last Wednesday, a federal district judge in D.C. ruled that the government must find a less restrictive means of detention for the young aliens who have already turned 18 and are flooding our border with drugs and gangs from Central America. They will now be released and disappear into our communities. And these judges are issuing things like nationwide injunctions. The lower federal courts, the Court of Appeals and the district courts, are creatures of congressional statute. Congress can make a determination that these courts should not have jurisdiction over certain matters. It would be possible, I think, for Congress to enact a law and as part of that law say that review of this will be limited to this panel, or actions taken pursuant to this statute will be reviewed by this panel, and the courts will have no subject matter jurisdiction over these matters, and that would be perfectly constitutional. But we've reached the stage now that I'm afraid that even if Congress did that in the exercise of its constitutional authority, that these tyrannical judges would go ahead and do what they want, because they're doing it right now anyway, and nobody is pushing back to stop them. Here's another one. This one relates to Ohio. Planned Parenthood has a right to taxpayer funding. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals told Ohio that it must fund Planned Parenthood so long as the company says those exact funds will not go towards abortion. And we're talking about a ruling that could cost the state of Ohio $1.7 billion in funding over the next 10 years or so to Planned Parenthood. And we can't even determine, as a state can't determine now how they spend their money. Do you understand the significance of this? What do you think it's going to do when it comes to religious freedom and other types of things that are going to come before the court? Here's another one. A state might be unable to control which private organizations it patronizes, according to the Sixth Circuit, but that's what the ruling that I just told you about. But according to the Seventh Circuit, the states are powerful enough to thumb their noses at federal immigration law and then claim a right to federal law enforcement grant. The Seventh Circuit, all three panel judges were GOP, Republican appointees, ruled that the DOJ cannot cut off funding to sanctuary cities. Thus, a state can't control its own funding, but it can control federal funding. Do you understand how stupid this is? We can't cut off Planned Parenthood, but we can prevent the feds from cutting off funding of state institutions that refuse to assist in enforcing federal immigration law. This is really Alice in Wonderland type stuff that we're dealing with. In a growing pattern, of course, this was one, mandating that Trump continue Obama's environmental regulations, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals issued an injunction on the Department of Transportation's delay of penalties to automakers that didn't comply with Obama's CAFE standards. Two of the three judges on that panel that made that decision were GOP appointees. DACA. There was the DACA decision. That was a law or an executive order that Obama put in place. It is questionable whether he had statutory authority to do that, essentially granting amnesty to certain immigrants. Trump has tried to overturn that, and the courts have said, no, you can't overturn that. So one executive can put it in place, but the next executive can't do that. So personally, I think what Trump should do is he should start firing people. He should start refusing to comply with these unconstitutional orders, and we'll see how that goes. I mean, we really are regardless of whether it was President Trump in there. I really would say the same thing if it was Obama. We're in a constitutional crisis. The courts have become the supreme law of the land. They become the supreme supra legislature. Now, this has a parallel in Israel where the exact same thing is going on. Israel does not have a constitution. They have something called the basic laws. Certain rights were granted to the Supreme Court, and Netanyahu's government could fail because people are trying to rein in the Supreme Court, which is filled with a bunch of left-wing liberal wingnuts that want to control everything in Israel. They can make decisions about where settlements can be built because they've taken on for themselves that they are the supreme law of the land. The Knesset and what they want to do, and the executive, what the executive wants to do, is irrelevant. So they are trying to change that now, but it's splitting apart Netanyahu's coalition because some people like what the Supreme Court does. And I don't think that the Republicans rise up and stop this because, you know why? Because they don't have the guts to enact these things into law, so they just let the Supreme Court do it. So we're in a major constitutional crisis. So that's one slide out of 80 that I've gotten done so far. So we're making great progress here. I've talked about this. This is an article in the new edition of The Atlantic, and it's titled Reality's End. I've mentioned this a number of times before. What's coming is the era of fake videos. The ability to make fake videos and make it look like Trump is saying something or somebody else is saying something the technology is now open source, essentially. It's cheap. People can now almost make out what is going on. It's going to become impossible almost to determine what's a real video and what's a fake video. Just wait till this is put in place in a campaign, and an opponent of somebody puts up a video of his opponent saying something totally opposite to what he believes. Now, I can tell you I follow, I'm on Facebook, and I see people, there's certain news websites out there. I think one of the worst ones is a place called Your News Wire. I don't trust anything I see on Your News Wire. They will occasionally be correct, but I would say 99 times out of 100, what they do is they take little snippets of information and put it into a sensational article. But I see friends and everything posting from Your News Wire. I've started to refuse to read the news articles because they're so bad. Now, like I said, occasionally they get it pretty right. But occasionally, there's another website. It's a satire website called the Babylon Bee. The problem with the Babylon Bee right now is that real life is so strange and weird that it's hard for the Babylon Bee to write satire about what's actually going on in the world. The things that they're doing. I don't have a slide for this. Here's an example. I think Jacob may have mentioned this yesterday in his talk. No, well, maybe it was a message that I have with somebody. But anyway, somebody sent me a video. It was from an organization called Welcoming Immigrants. And what they do is they read the passage in Matthew 25 about feeding the poor, clothing the poor, visiting in prison, and then they apply that to immigrants. And it was put out by people like Beth Moore, head of the female head of the Wesleyan Church, and a number of other people, including Johnny Erickson Tata. And what it is pushed is to push the acceptance of illegal immigrants. They even have a Bible study that goes along with it, and you can download it. And in the first week study, they talk about the passage in Romans 13 that says, let everyone be subject to the higher authorities. The Bible study says, well, we don't have to obey every order of government. And the suggestion there is illegal immigration might be one of those, that you don't have to cooperate if somebody comes and asks you a question. This is where it's going. The neo-Marxism and left-wing politics, feeling-based politics, is now sweeping over the evangelical church. I don't have time to do it this morning. I hope in the future to play some videos of some recent conferences that were had with Russell Moore and some other people. And I'm just telling you, folks, the leftism is winning. It has won. I know a few years ago people said, well, the emerging church is over, it's gone away, we don't have to worry about it anymore. And maybe we don't, because it's essentially, in my view, gone mainstream in evangelicalism. And it's an enormous problem. Okay, 2 slides down, 78 to go. Here's a study that came out from Pew. Maybe this explains why we are where we are. When Americans say they believe in God, what do they mean? Now, look, this is like most Pew polls. Here's one that they came out with. Do you believe in God or not? 80% said yes, 19% said no. But they also said that 56% believe in the God as described in the Bible. 23% of that 80% believe in some other higher power or spiritual force. Of the 19% that say they don't believe in God, about half of them do believe in some higher power or spiritual force. So we could probably do a study on the new confused atheist. And 10% do not believe in any higher power or spiritual force. A slim majority of Americans believe in God as described in the Bible, while 1/3 believe in some other higher power. So they broke that down a little bit into some more detail. Compared with older Americans, fewer young adults believe in an active, engaged God. And you can see the breakdown there. Believe in God, higher power, spiritual force. 83% of the 18 to 29 believe that, but it's only 43% believe in God as described in the Bible, whereas in the 65 and over, well, in this 50 and over category, it's about 2/3 of the people believe that. So you can see that in just a generation, it's changing dramatically. Compared with Republicans, Democrats are far less likely to believe in God as described in the Bible, and I might add ... so far. The trend is not very encouraging to me, given the way I think that especially our public officials conduct themselves. College graduates are less likely to believe in active, involved deity. This is not a surprise, right? This is sort of like saying the sky is blue or the sun came up this morning, although you can't always tell that in Ohio. In their beliefs about God, non-white Democrats more closely resemble Republicans than white Democrats. I wish I had, so this is not surprising because non-white Democrats are generally more religious than white Democrats. So they're going to believe in God. I didn't have time to put the clip in. Look up the congressional hearing where Diamond and Silk were questioned by members of Congress, particularly the questioning by Sheila Jackson Lee, I think is her name, from Georgia, and Hank Johnson. Those gals didn't give anybody any slack in their questions, and they went right back. I don't think I've ever seen anybody challenge congresswomen as well or as forcefully as these two ladies did. I was very impressed. So look it up. It was hilarious. Hank Johnson, by the way, he's the senator who a number of years ago during a questioning of an admiral about putting a base in Guam said that, well, he was concerned that if we put too much equipment and things in Guam that the island might tip over. And to which he asked the admiral gave, it was one of the best politically correct answers I've ever seen. He said something to the effect that, well, we didn't really give that much consideration. Instead of saying, you're a total idiot, man. I think that's what he was thinking, because he was sitting there looking at him, but he gave a very clever answer. But I did an interview the other night on a show called Minute to Midnight, and we talked about demographics. And I think this issue of demographics does play into the end times, because we are seeing this demographic wall coming that a lot of countries are hitting. Let me just give you a few examples. Europe is literally dying. The only thing that's keeping America in the positive growth mode, frankly, is immigration. Europe is dying. Africa is exploding in growth. Islamic countries are in many areas exploding in growth. Japan is dying, literally. The thing I've seen is that they sell more adult diapers in Japan than baby diapers now, because they have more adults that need them than they have babies. Spain has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. Russia has a very low birth rate. But even Iran is having demographic problems. They might have good growth. I think Zarif, their foreign minister, was at the Council on Foreign Relations the other day, and he said, we have 8% growth. And that's very good. So while we have a lot of people entering the work, but we have about 25% of the people who enter the workforce each year from being young people can't find a job. And that's leading to a lot of unrest in Iran. And I think the mullahs, I'll talk about it in just a moment, the mullahs know that the gig is up, and that's why I think they're reaching out into other countries, and I think that's why they're going to come against Israel. I just think the demographic issue is coming. But let me give you this. This is a professor at Duke University wrote this book, Stephen Smith. He lives in Europe, but he teaches at Duke in North Carolina, and it's called The Rush to Europe. Let me just share a little bit about what he says in there. Bombshell population growth in Africa means Europe is entering an unprecedented age of mass migration. Macron mentioned this the other day, or a couple weeks ago, in one of his speeches, asserting that the two continents' destinies are bound. The migratory phenomenon we are facing will be historic, declared the French president in a television appearance a week ago Sunday, when he announced that great poverty, climate change, and geopolitical conflicts will see what? Africans flooding into Europe for many years to come. The statistics are just absolutely incredible. In 2050, the population of Europe is projected to be, and again, I don't know if I still have to issue these disclaimers. The fact that I might use projections to 2050 do not mean that I don't think the Lord's coming back until after 2050. He may not come until after that time, but I'm just showing you the trends in population and demographics, because I do think they play into geopolitics in a very significant way. I think a lot of the things that we're seeing happening around the world today in the Middle East and these conflicts are related to demographics. So Europe is projected in 2050 to be a population of about 450 million, not a lot more than what they would have right now. Africa, though, is projected to have 2.5 billion people. Now, to show you how that's changed, since 1930, from 1930 to 2050, 120 years, the population of Africa will increase 8-fold. That's a stunning number. It was not too long ago that the population of Africa was somewhere in the order of 150 million people. Now we're talking about in the next 30 years from now, they'll have 2.5 billion. By the way, I also will give you this caveat. Every time I talk about demographics, I always say whatever they're projecting to happen 20 or 30 years down the road, back it up about 10 or 15 years. Because we know that as these Bible prophecy trends increase, they're increasing, they're speeding up, and things are happening on an exponential basis. I was talking at dinner the other night. I showed people a picture of a server farm. I shared one of those pictures here a few weeks ago. I said, do you know what this is? It looks like a server farm. I said it's a Bitcoin mine where they have banks and banks of computers to do these calculations all the time to mine Bitcoins. So if they do enough of these calculations, they get a Bitcoin. And so wealthy people are setting up these server farms all over the place. They're mainly targeting areas where there's very cheap power. So a lot of them are building these places up in the Pacific Northwest where we have hydroelectric power. And it's much cheaper than nuclear power or coal or whatever other people use. But the projections are that within 5 years, the growth of these Bitcoin server farms will consume power-wise what the entire world outputs right now in power. It can't be sustained. There are so many things that are happening in the world, pensions and that type of thing, that can't be sustained. 40%, though, of the African continent will be under the age of 15. They will, unless things improve economically in Africa, they will want to go someplace else. The most convenient place for them to go is Europe. So they are projecting, and Macron even acknowledged it, that there is going to be a huge population growth in Africa. In the north, and what's happening in Africa? Islam is pushing further and further south in Africa. And they're all going to go to Europe. A lot of them. What do you think that's going to do to the makeup of the continent of Europe? Unless things change. Unless somebody intervenes. The other thing that's growing in Africa is leftism. Radical leftism. So right now, the United States is the third largest country in the world in terms of population. Within a decade, I believe it is, by 2030, the third largest country in the world in terms of population. Of course, we know China and India are the two largest, then the United States. But within a decade, the third largest country in the world in terms of population will be Nigeria. They'll be approaching 400 million people. This type of demographic things has a huge impact. China is having a major demographic change. China is putting in place, they put in place a number of years ago, a one-child policy. What happened? They did forced abortions on people. The most people were allowed to have was one child, and they limited it to married couples could have one child. If you were a single woman, you were not allowed to keep your child, and they aborted the child. I almost said fetus. They aborted the child. With the result now that they have a rapidly aging population, and China is facing a demographic time bomb. So they've now changed it to allow 2 families, 2 children per married couple. But what they're doing is they are the women are required to go, I think, to the doctor. I heard this the other day on Frank Gaffney's show. They're required to go to the doctor 4 times a year to determine whether they're not fertile or they're not having a child. China is also instituting a social credit score. They have in place in China right now, I think the number was 200 million cameras. Within 2 years, they want to have somewhere between 600 and 700 million. They're putting in place social credit scores. People are losing their jobs. Their children are not able to get in universities because of what one person in the family has posted on Facebook or someplace else on social media. So like you have a credit score, they have a social credit score. Where are they getting the technology for this? Google, Facebook, other places. Do you think it's going to stay in China? Or it's going to come someplace else? So it's just something I think you need to be prepared for. My buttons don't seem to be. So we know that there was the thing in North Korea. Let me start off by leading up to that by talking about this. This was an article in the Wall Street Journal this week. North Korea announced that they were going to suspend nuclear testing. And what happened? Oh, it's so great. He's gotten, Kim Jong-un, he's become reasonable. He's a good guy now. He's stopping the nuclear testing. Why did he stop nuclear testing? The Wall Street Journal suggests that what happened was their test site in the last round of testing collapsed to the point that it was unusable. A large part of North Korea's underground nuclear test facility, which leader Kim Jong-un pledged to close, is unusable due to the collapse of a cavity inside the mountain after the last blast there, Chinese scientists say. Seismologists involved in a soon-to-be-published study also warned that another blast in the same spot with similar yield could cause environmental catastrophe. And they looked at, in the various nuclear tests, underground nuclear tests, what the seismology, the Richter scale readings were. And you can see that back in 2006, they were 4.3, 4.7, 4.9, 2016, 5.3, but the one they did last year was 6.3, and it caused essentially the test site mountain to collapse. And the word is that dozens, if not hundreds, of scientists and other support personnel were killed in that collapse. Do I think that what happened this week with regard to Kim Jong-un is prophetic? I absolutely do. Let me cover something else, though. I don't know if you saw this serial killer that was arrested in California. What they did was they created a fake genealogy profile for him online, the police. They then went to databases where DNA was stored, and they were able to find this guy and arrest him using public source, open information that's readily available to anybody on the internet. And they tracked him down this way. Now, look, I'm glad they caught the guy, if he's the guy. But I'm also concerned about the technology aspect of this, because we know that there's world leaders that would come on the scene that would use that in the wrong way, right? So we just need to be aware of that. New Yorker put out an article this really upset them. Chick-fil-A's creepy infiltration of New York City. They've opened 4 Chick-fil-A's in New York City, and the New Yorker magazine views that as a bad thing because they actually print Bible verses on their wrappers. And the people that own it believe in God. New York is taken to Chick-fil-A. This is a quote from the article. One of the Manhattan locations estimates that it sells a sandwich every 6 seconds, and the company has announced plans to open as many as a dozen more storefronts in the city. And yet the brand's arrival here feels like an infiltration, in no small part because of its pervasive Christian traditionalism. Its headquarters in Atlanta are adorned with Bible verses and a statue of Jesus watching a disciple's feet. Boy, pray for this poor snowflake that he'll get a clue. Well, here's I think one of the more important things that plays into Bible prophecy. Now, people are going to say, well, North Korea is not in Bible prophecy. But what we learn from studying the scriptures is the Bible prophecy is a pattern. And one of the things in the pattern is that, for example, in Thessalonians it says, when people say what? Peace and safety, peace and security, then sudden destruction comes. So here is a man, Kim Jong-un. He goes to Panmunjom and he steps across the border into South Korea, and the South Korea leader steps across. Here's Judy Woodruff on PBS report.
North meets South. Leaders of the 2 Koreas hold a dramatic summit. Their meeting along the heavily fortified border marked a day of diplomacy after months of war talk. It was quite literally a historic step. Kim Jong-un became the first North Korean leader to set foot in South Korea since the Korean War 65 years ago. He greeted President Moon Jae-in with a long handshake before inviting him to step onto North Korean soil. The official talks at the Peace House in Panmunjom focused heavily on North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Afterward, President Moon offered hopeful words but few specifics.
Today, Chairman Kim Jong-un and I confirmed that our shared goal is to rid the Korean peninsula of nuclear weapons through complete denuclearization.
The two Koreas have made similar statements in the past, but Kim said this time must be different.
Today, we will make sure that the agreement we have reached, which the people of the Korean Peninsula and the world are watching, does not repeat the unfortunate history of unfulfilled promises.
All of this comes after the North carried out a series of nuclear and missile tests, and after bellicose exchanges between Kim and President Trump raised war jitters. In January, the North Korean leader unexpectedly signaled that he was open to dialogue. This month, he announced Pyongyang will shut down its nuclear test site and suspend nuclear and missile testing. Today, a newfound friendliness was on full display, punctuated by easy smiles, frequent handshakes, and even laughter. The leaders planted a tree near the demarcation line using soil and water from both countries.
Standing face to face, I heartwarmingly realized that North and South Korea are not just neighbors that live separately, but rather a family. We who live so close by are not enemies that must fight against each other, but are more families that share the same bloodline who must unite.
Well, so I'm troubled by it, the reaction that people have had. Everybody runs around, oh, this is so wonderful. We have peace in North Korea. I mean, this guy and his family, since the end of the Korean War, have enslaved their people in some of the most brutal conditions on the earth. Concentration camps, labor camps, where they put people in generation after generation. One person does something bad, they imprison the next two generations to purify the society. They treat Kim Jong-un as a god. It's a cult. And so he comes and he does a few handshakes and he steps over a concrete block, and the whole world is a Twitter that we have peace. Now, personally, I view, and I think foreign policy has it right, I think that even foreign affairs is very skeptical of what's going on, because Pyongyang and the Kim family have done this many times before. And they play people. I also view North Korea as a subsidiary of China. China has given them very special, unique missile launchers where they can launch a missile in 30 minutes. Mobile missile launchers that could launch an intercontinental ballistic missile in 30 minutes, as opposed to 2 hours that they were doing before. So there's no advance warning. I don't see anything yet that they've been willing in the documents that they signed that they're giving that up. I think China is orchestrating this, and China has other plans. And we know China is trying to exert its influence other places. China this week rolled out for its first test its only aircraft carrier. It's kind of an interesting study if you look at that. There are 41 aircraft carriers in the world. This is a Soviet-era aircraft carrier that they bought unfinished from Ukraine, and it should be commissioned and hit the open waters in 2020. They have a couple more under construction. There are 41 aircraft carriers in the world today. 20 of them are under the control or owned by the United States. But everybody else wants them. But then China also has anti-ship ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles that they've developed one missile could take out an aircraft carrier. So aircraft carriers may be obsolete. As I said, things are changing very, very rapidly. As I watch this, the handshakes and everything, I hearken back to this event.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had...
Well, you're familiar with that. That was 80 years ago this fall that happened. Chamberlain returned from a meeting with Hitler in Germany and said, he held up the agreement. And what was the famous saying that he made? We have peace in our time. What was it, a few months before Hitler rolled through Poland? In connection with this, too, is there's this big push to use artificial intelligence to make determinations as to whether nuclear missiles should be launched or launched in response. And the experts that are studying it are very concerned about how this will work, how reliable it will be, but there's this big push by the technology and companies to put this in place. And even artificial intelligence experts are saying, well, wait a minute, how do we know that it's going to work? And a lot of the thinking in the foreign policy and geopolitical establishments now is that this will actually make things more volatile than it will be creating more deterrence. This is something that I think also plays into Bible prophecy. In Ethiopia, they're building a large dam in one of the headwaters of the Nile that is threatening to shut down a lot of the water flow in Egypt. Egypt relies on the Nile. They have about 90 million people. I believe that 98% of them live within a few miles of the Nile River. Could this lead to a conflict or war? There's even, there's a prophecy, I think it's in Isaiah, about the tower in Egypt that's destroyed and the flood that comes after it. I think that is a reference to the Aswan Dam. I think it's Isaiah chapter 26. One of the things that's rising in the world, though, is anti-Semitism. David Collier tweeted this the other day. I think it was a very wise tweet. For 60 years, anti-Semites told Jews to go to their home in Palestine. The European Jews that did not go suffered genocide. For the next 70, anti-Semites have been saying Jews should get out of Palestine. The truth is they want a world without Jews at all. And we see this happening all the time. Iran continually issues threats. Even the mullahs are, I think, a little bit concerned about what's going on in Iran. This is a tweet from one of the Ayatollah Javadi Amoli, who is considered to be one of the potential successors to the Ayatollah Khamenei, who seems to keep going, even though he's been very ill over time. Sometimes I wonder if they're just, using cryogenics to keep these people going, but that's for another topic for another time. He said this, he tweeted this week. Translation: if the people rise up, they will throw us into the sea. Many have already fled, many of the leadership have already fled, and some have prepared where they will flee to, but we have nowhere to escape to. So they're concerned about this. Now, Israel had an interesting thing this week. A major tragedy resulted from flash flooding. On the right is a street in Jerusalem, one of the main streets in Jerusalem, when they had a massive rainstorm this week. This is out in the Negev desert, some flash flooding that occurred out there. And it came on very suddenly. And what happened was there were 9 teenagers that were on actually 10, 9 female, 1 male, young people, 16, 17, 18 years old, that were out in the desert hiking near the southern part of the Dead Sea in a canyon area, and they were killed in a flash flood down there. It's a major tragedy in Israel. I didn't see that much in the news about it, to be honest with you. I did notice that in a lot of the newspapers around the world yesterday, rather than talking about the tragedy in Israel and losing 10 young people, they were talking about what was going on at Gaza and some people getting hurt there, some people even being killed when they stormed the fence, but very little talk about what happened to these teenagers. And this really what you can only determine is a massive tragedy. Well, this week the UN Security Council met, and they had a discussion at the Security Council about the situation in the Middle East. It's almost a weekly agenda item at the Security Council. Danny Danon talked about the Iranian threat. Here's a short clip of what he had to say.
Throughout the riots of the past months, Hamas has used innocent Palestinian women and children as human shields while they cowered behind in safety. The terrorists are hiding while allowing, even hoping, for their people to die. This is evil in its purest form. Mr. President, we speak often of the threats posed by Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Assad regime in Syria, but we cannot forget that these threats lead back to one source, one common thread. The Iranian regime is a dangerous thread that ties these threats together. We are presenting this image to the world so you can understand the depths of Iran's involvement in Syria. What you can see here is Iran's central induction and recruitment center in Syria. There are over 80,000 Shia militants in Syria under Iranian control. It is at this base, just over 5 miles from Damascus, where they are trained to commit acts of terror in Syria and across the region. This is yet another example of Iran's presence in Syria, of which we have warned you time and again, a presence that includes the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, airfields, weapons factories, and key elements of Syria's economy. In February, Iran launched an unarmed aerial vehicle from Syria into Israel. Luckily, the Israeli Air Force was able to shoot it down. Our thorough investigation has left no doubt that this drone was an Iranian UAV. It shares key indicators and markers of the Iranian Shahad 129s that have fallen over Syria and Pakistan in recent years. When we investigated the remains of the downed UAV, we discovered that it contained explosive materials. These materials were different than those used in the missiles that intercepted it. The conclusion is clear. This UAV not only violated our sovereignty, but was meant to be used as an offensive weapon against targets in Israel.
Now, I'm going to shut the sound down on this. This is the Russian Federation ambassador to the UN speaking. And essentially what he said is, look, we have a lot of problems in the Middle East. There are outside actors involved in the Middle East that shouldn't be there. I think he excludes Russia from that because, of course, it's okay for them to go and interfere wherever they want. Nobody else can go interfere. He also said that the core issue that needs to be resolved in the Middle East is, guess what? Palestinian-Israel peace situation and the implementation of a two-state solution. And he specifically said that one of the most damaging things that's going to possibly cause a conflagration in the Middle East, it will occur on May 14th when the United States moves its embassy and opens its at least temporary embassy in the city of Jerusalem. And there are at least 5 other countries I hear that are following on with that. So Russia is not stabilizing. Now, Russia has said they're going to give S-300s to Syria. I think they've already brought some of those things in, but then Sergei Lavrov came out and said, no, we said we would do it soon. I think they're probably already in place. I think Israel has the ability to do this. The Russian ambassador also noted that there was a schism in the Palestinian ranks between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority people, and peace wasn't really feasible until they got that resolved. This was from a week ago, the Jerusalem summit that the Arab League had, headed up by King Salman of Saudi Arabia. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Saudi Arabia is now our friends in Israel. They've supported Israel, but when push comes to shove, and one of the peace plans that's put forward is the Saudi-backed Arab peace plan to divide up Israel, to divide up Jerusalem, that's still in place. That has not changed. So I personally believe that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is running around trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes. And just like what happened in South Korea this week, everybody was all aflutter about how this is a move towards peace and we're going to have peace for mankind. My friends, the world is set up for the coming of a world leader who will come in and say, I have the plan for worldwide peace. We know that that will lead to the destruction of millions, billions of people in a very short period of time. But the world, every time you see this happen, the world gets all we have peace, we have peace. There were even people on the left this week suggesting that President Trump should maybe get a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, I'm all for peace. Don't get me wrong. But I also understand human nature, and we have decades and decades of history of what North Korea has said and done. Don't have time to go into it, but Melanie Phillips, speaking of Chamberlain, she related in her article this week, The Three Islands of Western Cultural Exceptionalism. It's an excellent article about anti-Semitism and some of the things that are going. She mentioned watching for the second time on her flight, she's in the United States right now, watching The Darkest Hour. I don't know if you've seen this movie about what happened when they had to evacuate from Dunkirk and the speeches that Churchill was making in Parliament and that type of thing to rally the British people. And she says, essentially, we live at that time right now. By the way, if you want to hear Melanie and you have some free time, she will be at Parkside Church in the Bainbridge campus right there near Solon, Chagrin Falls, in that area in Cleveland tomorrow night, Monday night, April 30th at 7 p.m. at Parkside Church. It's a free event. It's a large church. I think they can seat, I would guess, 3,000 or 4,000 in their auditorium. So if you want to hear her speak, Pastor Alistair Begg likes her, respects her, and invited her to come and speak at their church. So you can go listen to her, and I'm sure I have a feeling she's going to be talking about some of these same subjects. Let me conclude with just one thing. I want to follow up on something that I talked about last week. Seth Fransman has a great article about Syria, the largest and most important conflict of the 21st century. I do think that it is bringing this. He's a Jewish writer. He lives in Israel. He's a friend of Brian Schrager. It's a very good article. You should look it up at the National Interest. It's also over at The Hill, talking about some of the issues going on and how all these things are converging in the Middle East. Even Tom Friedman was writing about it the other day. Are Iran and Israel headed for their first direct war? The difference in what's happened in the last few weeks that they're actually shooting at each other directly. The UAV, the unmanned aerial vehicle that flew in with weapon that was weaponized, and the response of Israel that went and they actually bombed a base that killed some people. I mentioned last week that there was this Marmuk refugee camp. The battle continued there this week. To give you an idea how big this is, if you took the area where Polaris Mall is and the surrounding roads and doubled it in size, and then put a few 100,000 people in it, that would give you an idea of the density of Marmuk. For those listening online, Polaris Mall is a large mall area on the north side of Columbus. That was attacked this week. Here's a picture of some of the, this is the Marmuk camp here, and you will see they're dropping bombs in there. They're clearing out ISIS and other related rebels. But there was a big news article that said there have been 1.2 million Palestinians that have been forced out of Syria. Now, do you hear anything about that? Do you hear anything about those atrocities? I could talk about the little boy who died yesterday in England, who was denied the ability to go out of the country and get treatment. I'm going to close with this. I have a friend. His name is Mark Van Niekerk. He's from South Africa. And he's been in the Kurdish areas of Syria, Iraq. I just want to share a couple of his stories. Pray for Mark. You can support him. You can find his Facebook page. And he has a PayPal account with his Gmail address. And they go and they're giving money to these people. They've been in refugee camps. They've been talking to doctors. I just want you to listen to a couple of these stories of what he's been doing over the past week, because I think, this is someone I have tremendous respect for. Our first visit was to the home of a woman and her young daughter, the two bereft of husband and father. As members of Daesh put a gun to her husband's head, both ran crying to cling to the man in their lives. "You're a collaborator," they said, pulling the trigger. The blood gushed out, covering the wife, and the little girl felt the warm flow down her face and shoulder. A beautiful young girl sitting fearfully crouched beside her mother. The woman's brother, one of the Daesh fighters, sat next to me listening to our conversation. This just happened this week. He was unmoved. If I'd not been told he is a killer, I'd have thought he is one of the many victims. Police know about him, but have yet have no witnesses to charge him with murders in the Daesh cause. Our next family we visited was also deeply involved with the movement. Family members were both part of Daesh, while other women within the family had husbands murdered by them. Our interpreter asked if I'd like to say something. I spoke about God being the one who would avenge. That was the only way to continue in this life. It was by turning to the one who the Quran says is returning in judgment. They should turn to him if they didn't want to be condemned. Trying to bring a message of repentance and understanding God's grace and mercy is easy in the West. Not so here, where a whole cultural argument needs to be used to explain what forgiveness means. Heavens, some are leaving the villages and relocating in an attempt to put distance between feuding family members. Retribution must be meted out for any number of transgressions, and they linger for generations. And here I am thinking I can explain God's mercy. But we did our best to explain the only way forward was by embracing the shed blood of Yeshua. The third group, this is the last one I'll share, was one of 5 women. All are now single. One widowed as a teenager sits with children on her lap. Another whose husband's left with the second wife, taking her 7 children with them. The other 3 lost husbands in combat. How do you cope, I asked her, whose husband abandoned her for a younger wife. How can you live without your children? I'm dead, she whispered. I have nothing left inside. Nothing. My interpreter led her to the Lord. Within minutes of sharing the gospel. But this is indeed rare. One of his problems is getting her to use wisdom and remain quiet about becoming a Christian. But she won't, and determinedly lets it be known. What has she got to lose? The other women in the group have been exposed to the Christian message and are counting the cost. As we sat there talking, the new Christian woman could not withhold her hatred and disgusted ISIS in their belief. Another woman started arguing, telling her not to speak badly about Islam. Yet they had recently asked a mullah to help them. Do you think you are better than us, that we must help you? Was the crude retort from the imam. What is their future? What do they hope for? The Americans set goals for themselves, the interpreter said. This is a foreign concept here. No one has a vision. No one aspires to anything. The future is in the hands of God, they said. They will find out in the future what will happen. They were very different to the other women and smiled or laughed a few times. Maybe the liberty of the Bible message will set them free, but then free to do what? To be killed for their new faith? So they will remain Muslims outwardly while believing in their hearts. And the stories go on. So pray for Mark and his ministry. Pray for these new believers there, that they will stand firm and fast in their faith, and that they'll trust in the God who is their refuge. Let's pray. Father, pray that you will watch over us this day. Help us to be bold and stand strong for their faith like these believers, young believers, new believers do in the face of certain persecution, even to the point of death. Pray that we will learn from their examples and that we will be bold in our faith here in a culture that is changing but is not yet anything like what these Christians experience. Pray that you will watch over those people, keep them strong, let them share the message with others in this time. In Jesus' name, amen.